Laughter is contagious. We have all heard the phrase. A friend starts to giggle at a joke you didn't quite hear, and suddenly you find yourself chuckling along. It is one of the most basic human connections we have. But what happens when the laughter doesn't stop? What happens when the giggling turns into a scream and the smile becomes a mask of pure agony? Imagine a world where a simple laugh is not a sign of joy, but the first symptom of a terrifying, uncontrollable plague. A plague that doesn't attack your lungs or your blood, but your very mind. This isn't the plot of a dystopian horror film. It is a documented historical fact. In 1962, in the quiet region of Tanganyika, now known as Tanzania, a group of schoolgirls began to laugh. They laughed until they cried. They laughed until they fainted. And then they passed it on. Before the year was over, thousands of people were trapped in a psychological nightmare that defied every law of medicine. Tonight, we step into the archives to uncover the mystery of the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. A story that proves the most dangerous virus on Earth might just be the human psyche itself. To understand the horror, we have to go back to January 30th, 1962. The setting was a mission-run boarding school for girls in the village of Kashasha. It was a normal morning. The air was humid, the students were focused on their lessons, and the world seemed stable. But at approximately 10 a.m., 3 girls began to giggle. At first, the teacher ignored it. Every classroom has its disruptions, but the giggling didn't fade into a hush. It grew louder. It became high-pitched, rhythmic, and frantic. Within minutes, the giggling had spread to nearly 100 students. The teachers tried to restore order, but they quickly realized they weren't dealing with a prank. The girls weren't laughing at something funny. They were laughing because they couldn't stop. Their faces were contorted. Some were clutching their stomachs in pain. Others were weeping, even as the laughter exploded from their throats. The school was forced to shut down by the afternoon. The authorities assumed it was a localized incident, perhaps a strange reaction to something in the food or a bizarre case of teenage rebellion. They sent the girls home to their respective villages, thinking that the fresh air and the presence of their families would break the spell. They couldn't have been more wrong. By sending those girls home, they were unknowingly releasing the infected into the general population. The laughter was no longer confined to the walls of a classroom. It was moving. It was traveling across the countryside like a ghost. As the girls arrived back in their villages, the virus leaped from person to person. It hit the village of Nshamba first, then Bukoba. In every location, the pattern was the same. It would start with 1 or 2 people, and within hours, dozens more would be caught in the grip of the hysteria. But here is where the story turns from strange to truly disturbing. This wasn't just laughing. The clinical reports from the time describe a much more violent physical reaction. Along with the laughter, victims suffered from respiratory issues, fainting spells, and sudden inexplicable rashes. Some victims became aggressive, lashing out at anyone who tried to touch them. They weren't just happy, they were in a state of total physiological collapse. Imagine being a parent in one of these villages. You see your daughter return from school, and you think she's safe. Then she looks at you with eyes full of terror and begins to laugh, a sound so shrill it sets your teeth on edge. You try to hold her to calm her down, but she fights you with a strength she shouldn't have. And then, as you watch her struggle, you feel a tickle in the back of your own throat. You try to swallow it down. You try to breathe, but the urge is too strong. You open your mouth, and the sound that comes out isn't yours. It's the sound of the plague. By the time the epidemic reached its peak, over 1,000 people were officially affected. Schools were closed across the region. Entire villages were paralyzed. People were afraid to speak to their neighbors. They were afraid to look each other in the eye. The medical community was baffled. Blood tests were run. Water supplies were checked for toxins. Doctors looked for signs of meningitis, encephalitis, or even a strange new strain of the flu, but every test came back negative. Physically, there was nothing wrong with these people. Their brains were healthy, their blood was clean, their bodies were functioning perfectly. Except for one thing, they were trapped in a loop of involuntary mirth that lasted anywhere from a few hours to 16 days. The experts of the time were desperate for an answer. Some blamed a cultural curse. Others suggested it was a reaction to a bad batch of corn. But as the months dragged on and the laughter showed no signs of stopping, a new theory began to emerge. A theory that was far more unsettling than any biological virus. They began to call it Mass Psychogenic Illness, or MPI. But to the people living through it, it felt like something else. It felt like the world was losing its mind. The question that still haunts researchers today is, why? Why laughter? And why did it happen in 1962? To find the answer, we have to look deeper into the shadows of the time. We have to look at what was happening in the hearts and minds of the people of Tanganyika. Because as it turns out, the laughter wasn't a joke. It was a scream for help that the world refused to hear. To understand the 1962 epidemic, we have to look at the environment these girls were living in. Tanganyika had gained its independence from British colonial rule just weeks before the first laugh echoed through the halls of the Kashasha school. The world, as these children knew it, was being dismantled and rebuilt in real time. There were new expectations, new pressures, and a sudden crushing weight of responsibility placed on the shoulders of the youth. In the mission schools, the discipline was rigid. The curriculum was demanding. The students were caught between a traditional past and a modern, uncertain future. Psychologists who studied the case decades later, like Christian Hempelmann, began to see a pattern. They realized that the laughter wasn't caused by a virus in the air, but by a pressure cooker effect in the mind. Think of the human psyche like a steam engine. If you keep stoking the fire, adding stress, fear, and cultural upheaval, and you never open the release valve, eventually the engine is going to blow. In 1962, for the people of Tanganyika, laughter was that release valve. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological breaking point. This phenomenon is known as Mass Psychogenic Illness, or MPI. But don't let the scientific name fool you into thinking it's harmless. MPI is essentially a hack of the human hardware. It begins with a single person who is under extreme stress. Their brain, unable to process the anxiety, converts that mental pain into a physical symptom, a twitch, a faint, or in this case, a laugh. But because humans are social creatures, our brains are hardwired for empathy and imitation. When we see someone in distress, our own neurons begin to fire in sympathy. In a high-stress environment, that imitation can become involuntary. The symptom spreads like a wildfire across a dry prairie, jumping from one nervous system to the next until the entire community is trapped in a feedback loop of hysterical behavior. But here is the truly terrifying part of the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. It lasted for over 18 months. Think about that. Most cases of mass hysteria are over in a few hours. This persisted for a year and a half. It suggests that the stress wasn't just a temporary fluke. It was a systemic failure of the human environment. It proved that if you push a population hard enough, the very fabric of their reality will begin to tear. The laughter wasn't a sign of joy. It was a collective scream for a world that made sense again. It was the sound of 1,000 minds breaking at the exact same time. As quickly as it began, the epidemic eventually faded. The schools reopened. The villages returned to their daily routines. The laughing plague became a footnote in history books, often treated as a bizarre curiosity rather than a medical warning. But if we think we are safe from such a phenomenon today, we are gravely mistaken. In fact, we might be more vulnerable now than at any point in human history. In 1962, the laughter had to spread through physical contact. It required people to be in the same room, to look into each other's eyes, to hear the sound with their own ears. The virus moved at the speed of a walking person. But today, we live in a world where we are all connected by a digital nervous system. We are constantly exposed to high-stress information, global crises, and social pressures that would have been unimaginable to a schoolgirl in 1962. And our imitation neurons are firing faster than ever before. Researchers have already started to notice modern versions of the Tanganyika epidemic. In 2021, doctors began seeing a massive surge in tic-like behaviors among teenagers across the globe. These weren't caused by Tourette's or any known neurological disorder. They were caused by social media, specifically by watching videos of others with similar tics. It was the same mechanism as the 1962 laughter, Mass Psychogenic Illness, but this time it was being transmitted through fiber optic cables and smartphone screens. The pressure cooker of the modern world is much larger, and the release valve is now global. When we look back at the archives of the laughter epidemic, we like to think of it as a relic of a different time. We tell ourselves that we are too logical, too advanced, and too self-aware to fall victim to such a thing. But the biology of the human brain hasn't changed in 60 years. We are still the same social animals, still prone to the same glitches in our software. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic wasn't a one-time fluke. It was a demonstration of how thin the line is between our sanity and the collective madness of the crowd. It leaves us with a haunting question. If the world reached a breaking point again, if the stress of our modern, hyper-accelerated lives finally became too much to bear, what would our laughter look like? Would it be a tic? Would it be a scream? Or would it be something entirely new? Something that we wouldn't even recognize as a symptom until it was too late to stop the spread. The next time you find yourself laughing at a video on your phone or joining in on a viral trend because everyone else is doing it, take a moment to listen to the sound of your own voice. Ask yourself if you are laughing because you want to, or because your brain has simply lost the ability to stop. Laughter is a gift, they say. It's the best medicine. But in 1962, in the quiet hills of Africa, it was the ultimate poison. And the archives show that once the laughter starts, no one knows when or if it will ever end. This is Mystery Archive, and sometimes the most terrifying thing you can hear in the dark is the sound of someone who can't stop smiling. Stay safe and try to keep your head, because the next epidemic might be just one click away.